Alright, so today we're going to be doing something a little bit different from my other videos where I usually just talk about history and react to history videos. This one is more an alternate history, so what if something had been different? How would the world look? What would have happened instead? This one is called What If the World War II Never Happened? Very excited to try out some alternate history. I'm a big alt history fan. And I've heard some of these videos are very good on here, so I'm going to check this one out. And it'll be a little bit different because instead of commenting on historical stuff, I'll instead be looking at the plausibility of these events and plausibility of the divergence point, and if I agree or not with what the outcome is according to this person. So let's take a dive right in.
Hello audience, Mr. Z here on this dark, stormy night in collaboration with my pal from across the pond, VC3 Productions. If you'd like to understand a little more about how Hitler came to power and how he changed Germany, go check out his video after this one. We, on the other hand, will be exploring the grander effects of the Second World War and how the world might have been had it simply never happened. Surely you must be curious of the details on precisely how such a thing could have occurred, as yes, there was a fairly heavy stockpiling of fuel for these fires of war, from Germany's treaty-breaking remilitarization to their territorial expansion. We could simply prevent the ignition of that fuel, but that tension between nations would still exist, and likely manifest in the form of numerous smaller wars over the course of a few years. But I can work with that. So, what is our ignition point for World War II? Poland, of course. And why did Germany invade Poland? Well, for land. For other things too, but we don't want to get demonetized here. Specifically land lost in the wake of the First Great War, known as the Polish Corridor, which separated Germany from its land in East Prussia. Many of you are likely familiar most with the city of Danzig, which some might confuse for the entirety of the Polish Corridor, but there was a difference. It's about half. So, holy frickin' smokes. So, Germany and Poland already have a non-aggression pact, and a bargaining over the territory, while unlikely, isn't out of the question. See, that corridor is Poland's only port into the sea, something which happens to be quite essential to any nation that hopes to make a name for itself internationally, and not remain dependent on surrounding nations, which, if you're Poland, you know never ends well for you. But perhaps a compromise could be made. Poland had been looking to re-establish the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth following World War I, and with the neighboring USSR, a union with a country as formidable at fighting the communists as Poland wouldn't be such a bad idea for little old Lithuania there. So, if we assume Poland and Germany enter into an agreement to defend Lithuania from the USSR in exchange for the establishment of the PLC for Poland, we now have an arrangement which for Germany restores the pre-war Reich and earns it a powerful buffer ally against the Soviets, while Poland restores its ancestral borders and enters into a defensive pact with Germany. Yes, I know many of you will argue that German goals would have included the destruction and conquest of the USSR, but such a thing is still achievable through collaboration with Poland, and later partitioning the land or just backstabbing Poland and taking it all, which they are basically very capable of. This is Germany we're talking about, folks. Don't underestimate them. Alternatively, Germany could seek to restore some colonial assets in Africa lost during World War I for the resources there. Regardless of which, there are at least a few options for Germany to still achieve their goals while remaining allied to Poland in this arrangement. And even if that wasn't the case, I could argue for a timeline in which Germany invades Poland with France and Britain simply doing nothing. Why? Because up until Poland, that was the case. And there's no reason to assume Poland would have been any different. Italy invades Ethiopia despite both being members of the League of Nations and annexed the region while the League did nothing. Germany annexes Austria, and the League does nothing. Japan invades China, and the League did nothing. Germany invades Czechoslovakia again, and the League did nothing. Although, it was at this point that Neville Chamberlain did put forth that Britain and France would accept Germany's claims to the land, so long as there'd be no further aggressive expansion by Germany. But this could not stop further partitioning of Czechoslovakia and demands for land aimed toward Poland and Lithuania. And even after that, Italy still conquers Albania. So, Britain and France could, in the sake of not wanting to risk another Great War, simply stand down and accept that Germany is hell-bent on eastward expansion. Or, better yet, the nations could come to a resolution of redrawing borders to create a union out of Poland and Lithuania to defend against both German and Soviet aggression, while ceding the Polish corridor back to Germany in exchange for a peace pact between Germany, Poland, Britain, France, and Lithuania to cease all military expansion then and there. Germany could voice any remaining demands for land, and a vote could be put forth for exactly what exchanges will be made to acquire said land. Such a thing isn't too far-fetched. Hell, Germany just paying Poland for the land, and Britain and France mediating it, saying, yeah, this is alright. As even in our timeline, Germany continued negotiating for the city of Danzig, albeit aggressively, up until the invasion of Poland, going as far as to ask for at the very least a referendum of unification with Germany to be put to a vote by the citizens of the region. Since we're looking for the best means to prevent World War II and reduce as many national conflicts as possible, we'll be redrawing borders like this. Germany is able to fully reunite with East Prussia and restore some pre-war land holdings within Poland, with a Slovak Republic proxy state and a return of World War I German African colony Cameroon to appease German desires for greater resources. Poland and Lithuania unite into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, while a plan is established and invitation put forth to the other Baltic states and Finland to join the Union should political or military pressures from the USSR rise. Germany is allowed access to Polish ports and allowed to maintain a limited number of bases along the Polish-Soviet border in exchange for German military support should conflicts arise between the USSR and Poland. At the time, there were tremendous concerns over the industrial development of the USSR, and there were some real worries by not only its neighbors, but Britain, France, and even Germany, who feared the future of a Europe potentially falling to communism country by country. So it's fairly realistic to imagine these states, having put aside their differences, focusing on containing the USSR and communism from leaking to the rest of Europe. Italy would remain a belligerent, but granted the poor state of its military supplies, they wouldn't pose too significant a threat, and if not giving up after an initial number of failed campaigns, likely against either France, Greece, Britain, or Yugoslavia, they'd certainly find themselves forced back into their place. Japan in this time...
Yeah, Italy was not a very capable fighter in World War II. It's kind of a joke about how bad they were when the Allies actually invaded Italy. And they worked their way up the peninsula pretty quickly until Italy actually surrendered and started pulling its troops back. At that point, the Germans came in and they fortified the line and stopped the Allies dead in their tracks. Also, the Polish corridor really was Germany's excuse for invading Poland. They definitely made up some other things too, but that was really their reason to take Poland. That if we're going to take back the Polish corridor in Danzig, we're just going to take the whole thing. But they ended up giving part of it to the Soviet Union, and then backstab the Soviet Union. So I'd be interested to see how he's going to talk about that, because Germany seems to have a habit of backstabbing its allies during this time period.
Time would continue its campaign against China, while the Soviets supported the Chinese communists through the north. French Indochina likely wouldn't fall under Japanese control, as France would never be invaded by Germany, and authority would never be handed over to Japan. Tibet, having been caught between the Kuomintang, communist and perhaps eventual Japanese rule, sought protection from Britain and would soon become a protectorate. The Chinese communists would establish a new People's Republic with Mongolia under heavy Soviet influence, while Japan pushed deeper into mainland China. The Baltic states and Finland, following increased strongmanning by the Soviet Union, would enter into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to establish the Intermarium, a between-seas border state whose purpose would be to prevent conflicts between Eastern and Western Europe. This would have been the earlier mentioned plan Britain, France, and Poland had agreed upon to ensure peace throughout Europe for the foreseeable future. This would, with the later addition of Romania, who stood now alone at the Soviets' Western Front, create a massive buffer state between Russia and Western Europe, with a military capable of fending off either the USSR or the German Reich, who would have been thriving on the European economic scene, becoming a leading producer in weaponry, industry, mechanics, and more, allowing it to purchase a number of colonial holdings from France, who was at the time undergoing its own gradual regime change. See, prior to the war, in our timeline, France was seeing some internal political upheaval. Having seen some of the worst battles of the First Great War, there was a tremendous amount of disillusionment and dissatisfaction within veterans and the youth, all of whom sought to make a change in their society. This led to, just as in Germany
Yeah, so it's within France at the time. There was a lot of there was a lot of strife between different groups. There were fascist groups, the communist groups, other socialist groups, the Republican groups. A lot of disillusioned veterans, a lot of young people who were not wanting to be part of the military. A lot of people were afraid of growing German aggression. France was in a mess. That's why they fell so quickly, is because they really couldn't coordinate themselves and they couldn't really unify themselves well enough that Germany came in as a unified, powerful force and just destroyed them in 6 weeks. That's how long it took for the fall of Paris and fall of France, was 6 weeks. So there was a lot of issues there, and it's been argued that if World War II had not happened, that there may have been a civil war or revolution in France. I'm going to be interested to see if he brings this up.
Decade prior, numerous far-right and far-left parties rising. And just before the outbreak of the Second World War, the far-right French Popular Party, not to be confused with the far-left French Popular Front, despite having been outlawed by the French Republic, was booming in popularity. It, along with the also far-right French Social Party, that's, French Social Party, that just sounds like a friendly gathering. La Partie Sociale Française, that's better. And it is often speculated that had war not broken out, France would have gone much the route of Spain, Italy, and Germany, while Britain might see its own right-wing wave rise to counter the new focused enemy of communism. This regime change in France could lead the way for Italy to attempt to establish the Latin bloc with Spain and France, but Italy, it's Italy. It probably wouldn't happen. And while we're on the subject of regime change, the US is still facing down the Depression. Japan is far too preoccupied with its business in China to direct forces elsewhere, now dealing with remnant Kuomintang soldiers and Chinese communists along the northern border. Thus, Pearl Harbor would need to wait, and the US war industry has never kicked into gear. The US simply would have no war to supply overseas, and FDR's policies, be it intentional or not, bring the nation closer and closer to socialism day by day, with greater taxation, government spending, and social services being established, while the still struggling public feels it's not enough. Earlier on in 1930, there had been fears of a supposed business plot to overthrow FDR and install a pro-corporation fascist government, driving the US not to have a red...
Yeah, the business plot is actually a very interesting event, where a group of fascist organizations worked with a number of very rich men within America, rich, powerful businessmen, in an attempt to overthrow the U.S. government and establish a fascist regime. It, of course, never happened. It really never got off the ground. It was never more than much of an idea, but it was something that was a result of a growing trend of growing sympathies for fascism in America, mostly as a reactionary force to the growing socialism that was under FDR. Well, not socialism, but the social services that were seen by many as socialism under FDR, and a lot of people feared that FDR might be leading the country more towards communism, and so they sympathized more with the fascists in Europe who stood up against communism. So there was a bigger political divide going on in the United States at this time between two relatively smaller groups, whereas most people still sat in the middle with the democracy and Republicans, Democrats, and all of that. But there definitely was a growing trend of fascism in the United States. Not really for neo-Nazism, but definitely for Italian-style fascism, which was by far the much more popular form of fascism in countries that would become fascist.
Scare, but a fascist scare. The political scene in Europe left them feeling isolated. There was no one to sell to, especially with Germany now producing superior products locally and for a better price. Social services and policies were the only things cushioning the burden of the Depression, and FDR becomes increasingly desperate to find a remedy, pushing top income tax rates to 95%, while unemployment stays stagnant, even rising in some parts as business owners find themselves forced to shut down or hire fewer employees. The Soviets could take advantage of these conditions to begin lending aid to the US, disseminating pro-communist propaganda and even building factories on American soil to create more local jobs while aiding Soviet production. It would be through these gradual processes that the US would slide deeper and deeper into a communistic tunnel. And with the passing of FDR, so would the door be open for a further left America to elect a new leader to complete the task FDR had begun of creating a socialist America. The Soviets would certainly play some significant role in both funding and promoting the Communist Party USA, just as they had funded them during the Cold War in our timeline. Only now they'd have the opportunity to raise them to a higher position of power, and it would be with that done that the Soviets would conquer the US not through war, but through various means of subversion, cultural, economic, and political. The world of this timeline is a vastly different place. The US would never become a dominant world power and influence post-world Europe as it did in our timeline. Instead, it became a proxy state of the Soviet Union until it inevitably breaks off and becomes its own communist power, just as China or Yugoslavia did, likely going on to incorporate Central America and the Caribbean into a grander United Socialist States of America. Western Europe and its empires remain a dominant force in the world, never being weakened by the Second World War and being able to retain the majority of their colonial holdings. Germany and Britain would become chief competitors, while major conflicts between East and West are prevented by the Intermarium buffer state and a greater Yugoslav state keeping the Balkans united against the potential aggressions of either Turkey or Italy. War would likely begin to intensify between the Japanese and Soviets, while a communist America could pose a greater threat to the Japanese Pacific Empire. If the Japanese Empire proceeds to reinforce the Anglo-Japanese alliance, this could lead us to something of a greater world war that could draw in the US, Canada, Germany, and Intermarium. War on the grand scale, however, would be inevitable. While the conflict within Western Europe was resolved without bloodshed, a greater conflict between it and the communistic world now existed, and such a war would be greater than any conflict ever seen before. The US of Z, thanks you for watching.
So yeah, that was an interesting take on it, of World War II not happening. I know he was trying very hard to create a world in which World War II doesn't happen. However, I really don't see where Germany would not have backstabbed Poland at some point. The only way they would have tolerated Poland in any respect would have to put in a very German-friendly fascist government, and that still would have led to the persecution of minority groups within Poland, which there were many. Germany probably would have forced them to do so at the threat of invasion. Because the real central theme here is that fascism and communism are sort of the antithesis of each other. They really, really hate each other. They do not get along. Fascism usually rises out of fear of communism. Fascism did rise out of the fear of communism after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And so for Germany to not attack the USSR, there would have to be a lot of good reason. If Germany were to be selling resources and stuff off everybody else, they would have a lot more money than they even had in our timeline, and they would have a lot more capacity to fight. I feel like it would have been much more inevitable that Germany and the Soviet Union would have fought, and they may have backstabbed Poland to do so, or they may have coerced Poland into becoming a Nazi-like regime or a Nazi puppet state in order to do so and fought through Poland. As for the United States going down a communist route, that's iffy. Definitely more and more towards socialism, and it was definitely more growing feelings of sympathies for communism, but there was a much larger growing sympathy for fascism. I think the largest fascist group was the Silver Legion of America, which had somewhere between like 5 to 10 times the members the Communist Party had, and was growing fast. And there were other fascist groups as well, where there was really only one major communist group in America, which is the CPUSA, which still exists to this day, by the way, although they have about 5,000 members, I think. Anyway, yeah, he brings up some good points, but I feel like Germany's ambitions were too great, and the hatred between communism and fascism was too great. Inevitably, they were going to fight. At the end there, he does mention that the West would probably end up fighting the communists, and it would have been another war. I do believe that would be the result. I don't know how well Britain and France would have worked with Germany, though. France was terrified of militarized Germany. Britain wasn't too happy with the situation either. They were both democracies. France, more likely than not, probably would have fallen into civil war or revolution. They could have turned, which would have been just like Spain was, where you have one side that's backed by the Nazi Germany, one side backed by the Soviet Union, and to the point where they're actually sending troops, arms, supplies to back up the group. So what would have come out of France is very unknown. They could have become another fascist state that would have allied with Germany, or they may have been a communist state, which would have been an enemy to Germany and likely would have provoked Germany into attacking, which would have then provoked the Soviet Union into attacking Germany, thus creating a continental war. Where Britain would stand in that, who really knows? I don't know if Britain would really even get involved in that one, but they probably would just be looking off the low guys like Belgium and the Netherlands and saying, guys, leave them alone. But it's not to say that World War II is inevitable, but some global war, some similar to in scale, was inevitable. There was going to be something. There were too many factors playing into it. The best way for World War II to never happen is the Nazis to never come to power. But then you just see a growing tension between the democracies of the West and the communists, and in Russia. You would see Spain may have turned communist instead of fascist. France would have gone to civil war and turned communist. We probably would have seen a war between the communists and Western democracies, with the United States jumping into that war out of its fear of communism. It probably would have been much more supportive of a war with Germany at first, and that would have easily pulled the United States out of the Great Depression the way World War II did. So I definitely think he's got some good ideas here, but I tend to disagree with the outcome of everything and so the plausibility of everything. And in the end, I definitely agree, yes, there would have been a global war at some point, whether it's between the Nazis and the West or the communists in the West. Somebody was going to be fighting somebody. I don't know that Japan would have left America alone that long. They really wanted Pearl Harbor. I think once things calmed down, they may have still gone after it, especially if they perceived America to be weak. They did perceive America to be weak when they attacked it, but if they perceive America as being more of a puppet of the Soviet Union, they probably would have paid to fight even more, because they didn't think that a country that was following under the influence of another country was really going to be able to put up much of a fight. And really what Japan was looking for was a very quick and decisive win against the Americans. They never got that in our timeline. Instead, they had a long, drawn-out war in which they lost horribly. But in this timeline, they may have actually pulled it off. Without America's war industry kicking into gear, they may have actually pulled off a quick victory, because America wouldn't really want to fight. Or they could have picked a fight. The U.S. gets involved, and the Soviets also joined the fight on their behalf, since they're not fighting in Europe. And Japan would have just been completely overwhelmed and destroyed. There's a lot of possibilities to this. I think he does a really good job of describing possibilities. I know he was trying very hard to make a world without a World War II, but that's something that's very hard. Like I said, I think the only way to prevent that is to have a world without Nazi Germany. So I'm going to end the video right there. I really liked doing an alternative history video. I plan on doing more. I'm a big fan of alternative history, so if you have any other suggestions, please put them in the comment section. If you like the video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.